The Scuttlebutt is proud to welcome Millerstown Pick Apart, a self-service salvage yard where you can get parts you need for your car, truck, or van at very attractive prices because you do the work. Bring your own wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers, sockets, jacks, drills, or whatever you need, except for torches, to wrestle out the parts you need for the vehicles in the yard. Millerstown Pick Apart was created 17 years ago to provide reasonably priced solutions for auto parts needs. Millerstown is the perfect fit for those seeking discount auto parts to repair their own vehicles. Millerstown has a huge inventory of cars, which they purchase from individuals, towing companies, and auctions, and from its sister auto salvage recycling operation. For hours, directions, inventory, parts availability, and pricing, you can go to pickapartyard.com. That's PICAPARTYARD, pickapartyard.com, or call 724-224-4777. That's pickapartyard.com or call 724-224-4777.
That's one of those things that I think is so frustrating for me. The continuation of bad ideas, of knowing it's a bad idea, and still we continue on.
Welcome, everyone, to The Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're super excited for our guest today, where we're going to be talking with Adam Zaffuto about his service and about his work trying to bring Afghan refugees and interpreters over here to the United States. If you have been liking The Scuttlebutt, please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube. Plus, we always like hearing from you, so you can email me at Sean, that's SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Adam, welcome to The Scuttlebutt. I got an email from you, and I was really interested and excited to talk with you about the work you've been doing, but also the service that you had and your deployments. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, as Sean said, I'm Adam Zaffuto. I'm a local Pittsburgh veteran. I joined the Army in 2008, and I ended up doing 2 tours overseas, one in Iraq and another one in Afghanistan. My tour in Afghanistan was in 2013 in Zari district in Kandahar province. And also got to spend some time out in Helmand, working alongside some special operations folks and some Marines out there. A lot of the stuff that I did when I was in Kandahar, in Zari, I got to work with a lot of interpreters doing base defense security, doing working an entry control point for local nationals, and then working alongside the Afghan Army at our front base security, and as well as doing some training on training them with basically mortars and mortar tactics. That was my specialty in the Army, was mortars. So getting to go to Afghanistan and getting to kind of utilize all of those tools in a kind of getting to use those tools in your toolbox was a very unique experience. I really enjoyed being able to work with the Afghan interpreters. My first tour in Iraq, I was a radio man for a lieutenant in basically our infantry raid platoon. We're doing a lot of patrolling and a lot of night raids, which was back when you could still do night raids, those were very kind of like I feel the real tenseness of when people talk about no-knock raids here in the United States, because that's what we were doing in Iraq against some very, very dangerous people. So the intensity of that it's incredibly high. And so I was a radio man and got to do just about everything an infantryman gets to do in Iraq. And so my work as a radio man, I got to work with my interpreter as well as questioning prisoners and, talking to folks on the ground. And, you go into the same store that you patrol every single day and you talk to the same guy, and he gets to know you, and you buy a pack of smokes from him every day, and you get to learn little bits of information about the culture and about the people you're in that I found to be really useful. And our interpreters there in Iraq were mostly Kurds. We were on the kind of Sunni Kurd border in northern Iraq in a town called Hawija, which was a little bit closer to Tikrit than it was to Kirkuk. So it was a heavily Sunni city that was made up of mostly people from Saddam's tribe and from allied tribes to Saddam. So it had a very heavy Sunni Arab tribal alliance to Saddam in the area. So there was still murals of Saddam up on buildings when you would drive through, and you'd go to a town council and you'd ask them kind of what is it that they want? What can we do to stop the violence? And when they would say, bring Saddam back, we hung him.
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
It's not going to work.
Mhm.
And so kind of seeing the interplay between having a Shia army battalion in a Sunni city with bordering Kurdish towns was like this very unique interplay of seeing a lot of the major kind of ethnic sects in Iraq and how having a Shia army battalion basically precluded them from doing any work policing the Sunnis.
Mhm.
Because the insurgents were more interested in killing them and fighting the Iraqi army than they were in fighting us, which was like a daytime job for them.
Mhm.
So you find yourself in this position of like, we want the Iraqi army to help us, but they'll only help us in a couple of ways. Now, when we would go out to the Kurdish towns, it was like, I described it to a friend once as like, it was like opening the wardrobe and you step into Narnia. You know, you step into this different world where we went to a town and like you see all the military aged men grabbing their rifles and like walk into the outside of town. And you're like, it's interesting, you know?
Yeah.
Well, they were going out there to just defend the outskirts, and we went in and they had a feast for us, basically. Like we went in, we got to take our armor off, and our interpreter was like, no, these are good people. Like, take your armor off. And our platoon sergeant was, take your armor off, sling your rifles. You can go like play soccer with these kids and have a like sit down and have tea and have a meal, like have a feast for us. And it was very, very like a very unique experience. And then so I took all of that kind of like, oh, well, there's different cultures at play and there's things that you can learn from getting to know these interpreters. And hey, man, something that they know might just save your life. And it might just help you, like, might just help you get your guys home. And so going there as a sergeant now, like having that base of knowledge and getting to work with interpreters very closely, like I took as like, oh, well, soak up as much knowledge as you can from these guys. Cause there's a, I think particularly like American and Western thing of where if somebody speaks like, and maybe it's not an American thing. Maybe it's every culture finds that when somebody doesn't speak your language correctly, you kind of look at them in a bit of like, oh, what's this guy? Can't speak English, man. Like, and then you realize like, and so some of my younger soldiers, I made it a point to be like, hey man, just because that dude doesn't speak perfect English doesn't mean he's stupid. Doesn't mean he's in any way, shape, or form less intelligent than you, because all of our interpreters, they grew up here in Afghanistan. They know way more about the crazy cultural interplay that is going on in this country.
And in just that region. I mean, in just that, yeah.
Exactly. The Pashtuns and the Tajiks and the Uzbek and the Hazara, and it's this wild conglomeration of people. And like, hey man, those interpreters speak like 6 or 7 languages. You can read 4 or 5 of them. Like that's something that we as Americans, like we would look at that and we would, what is it, a polyglot?
Yeah.
This person is a polyglot and they're one of the miracles of our modern education system. And it's like, well, I don't know, man, these kids are growing up learning Dari, Pashtu, Farsi, Uzbek, you know, and they're speaking dialects of all of them.
Right.
And so that was something that I took as like, these guys not only have a huge amount of knowledge about just the language, but about the people. And like, hey man, what do I need to know about these people? Like, what are the things that I need to know? And one of the like those bits of information that you get from them is like, oh, don't trust the ANA guys because they're all smoking dope. Half of them are Taliban. 40% of them are Pashtun.
In Afghanistan, you mean? This is where, yeah.
In Afghanistan, half of the, you know, I think mandated in the Afghan constitution that was this idea for the Afghan National Army to be a truly national army. And that's, that I think kind of more gets into some of those structural and strategic failings of why things fell apart and how they fell apart so quickly.
And part of it is what you're already saying, and just there were so many different tribes and like, and as I've heard, a lot of these Afghanis don't even know what Afghanistan is. They're like, you say, this is the country. Yeah.
If I can stop you real quick.
Sure.
Afghans. So
Thank
Afghani is a currency, a denomination, or like a dog. So it's an Afghan. An Afghan is a person. An Afghani is a currency.
Thank you for that. I've not been corrected on that yet. So
that was beat into us by our sergeant major. Like, hey, Sergeant Major Lon Kindler. one of the finest leaders I've ever, that man beat that into our head.
So the Afghans, I had heard that if you tried to have them describe what Afghanistan is, that really wasn't a concept that they were used to.
Yeah. So you look at Afghanistan and you kind of have to think around it as this, well, it is an idea more than it is borders. Afghanistan's an idea. Afghanistan existed as an idea in the time of Alexander. Like, this existed. This was an idea, but it's always been these separate tribal people, and specifically along that kind of southern border, southern and rising up into the east into the Hindu Kush Mountains. That border along Pakistan is, the vast majority is Pashtun. And the Pashtun range like everywhere from down into Iran, all the way up into the mountains and all the way up towards China. And so that is a massive swath of people who consider themselves to be culturally Pashtun. But the Pashtun in southern Kandahar, right, out in Helmand, are going to be culturally far different than a Pashtun up in the mountains in Nuristan or up in the mountains in near the Korangal Valley. Like, those people were culturally, ethnically Pashtun, but they considered themselves like even this smaller offshoot of Korangali or Nuristani. And so everything breaks down in Afghanistan to these tribal groups. And you have this, now the Pashtun kind of, it's that border of Afghan Pakistan that there's also a vast majority of Pashtuns who live in Pakistan, but these are families and tribes that have existed far beyond Afghanistan or Pakistan ever existed. These family and clan relationships existed far before the British Empire decided that this was going to be a line we're going to draw on a mountainside.
Right.
So these family and clan groups don't particularly see that border as being anything other than some invention of who knows,
foreigners.
So exactly. So for them, it is meaningless for them. And so you have this Southern Pashtun cross-border culture, which doesn't particularly respect the ruling government of either nation state. And then Northern Afghanistan is where you kind of have the very wide mix of smaller ethnic tribes. Hazaras being a ethnic minority, kind of in the more northeast of Afghanistan. They generally have a more Asian appearance. The Hazaras, they're always been rumored they're the more of the descendants of the Mongols that stayed in Afghanistan. And then you have Uzbeks, and those are the same kind of cultural people that make up Uzbekistan, but they hold on to this idea of like, oh, well, yeah, but the Uzbeks in Uzbekistan aren't even really Uzbeks anymore because they had how many years of Soviet rule? So are they even really Uzbeks anymore? And they hold on to their cultural identity. And the same with the Tajiks. Like the Tajiks, hey man, we're like Afghan Tajiks. We're like the real Tajiks, And the Tajiks in Tajikistan, they've been exposed to all of the Stalinist Western, and they've lost their religion and they've lost their connection to their culture. And
is there a piece of that is like Russians also like married into Uzbeks and like sort of muddied the bloodline in a way?
I would say they look at it more through cultural lenses of like of disconnection to their culture. It's kind of like, well, these people they're not like Tajiks like us Afghan Tajiks are, because we stayed connected to it and we beat the Russians. You guys just made a deal with them. And that's also part of it, is this continual Afghan spirit of defeating the outsider, of the always ever present idea of, you have the watches, we have the time. We can wait, and we will wait. Not only are we going to wait, we're going to wait on the other side of a border. And we're going to wait inside of your supposed ally that you give hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to. We're going to wait inside of their borders, inside of areas that even they can't get to. You can't get to, they can't get to, nobody can get to. And so that's that idea of they can always just retreat deeper. There's always it. I kind of I look at it in a way of, when you looked at how the American army fought the Indians, especially in the Indian Wars, when you had multiple Sioux nations and tribes that were all just, they would come out and they would attack, and then no matter what you do, they would just retreat deeper back into the Black Hills.
Yeah.
You know, but the Black Hills were only so big. Afghanistan is unconquerable. It is the Black Hills on steroids. It is the Black Hills on genetic engineering and then steroids, and then, you know, just God going in and picking it up and lifting it higher, because it's just this massive elevation change that is, it really kind of, you struggle to look at it. I don't know, as a Pennsylvanian, like,
yeah, we just have these little Appalachian mountains, but you get into like, if you see any pictures down of the Korengal or the Pesh, it's just like, you're in the Rockies, like
you are in, it's the Rockies on steroids. And it is it's
the Himalayas, the southern tip of the Himalayas, right?
Yes, yeah, and it's snow-capped peaks, like you can see them. You're in Kandahar and you can look and be like, oh, there's, okay, there, you know. And that is like just the thing about Afghanistan. It's just this, you can always see the mountains from somewhere, even if you're down in a valley and it's like humid and it's hot, and you can be like, oh, but there's a mountain. And that's like, they're always just going to go up. They're going to keep climbing higher up.
And it's almost impossible to track that. Like that's where, you know, before we started recording, we were talking about how these outposts got established into the Pesh, into these very cultural towns where they speak a different language from one town to the next. You know, you could build as many bases as you want, but they were always going to get attacked, and they were probably always going to get left in the end.
It was you're asking people to at times win an unwinnable war. And that was, you were asking, and I think the some of the things that with the Korengal, that became such a kind of a highlight, I think, in America's mind, and I think it should be, and it should be. And if for anyone out there who, I tell everyone who wants to know what it was like to be an infantryman in combat in our modern wars, the two documentaries that Sebastian Younger made, Restrepo and Korengal, are absolutely amazing.
Incredible.
They are the best picture of what being in a infantry platoon in combat is like. And it was in the most intense combat that we've faced in decades. And these men that were up in these mountains they're being asked to control uncontrollable positions, to win an unwinnable war, to control an uncontrollable valley that's surrounded by mountains, and has not only is it a culture that seeks to repel the outsider at all costs. Like you said, Sean, the from valley to valley, they speak different dialects that don't correspond. And some of these Afghans' experience may be, their entire experience for a 60 or 70-year-old man may be inside of this valley, including possibly a Hajj to Mecca. But other than that, his entire experience has been this valley.
Right.
And so
they know every rock, they know every path, every inch of it.
Exactly. And we were dealing with specifically that up in the Korengal. I had a platoon sergeant who went in and relieved the 173rd Airborne after they had been doing the filming of Restrepo. And that was one of the things that he said, is the expanse and the scale of things was so shocking to him that in his first battle there, he grabbed his 60 mortar and sent a 60 mortar round, 60 millimeter mortar round downrange. And a 60 millimeter mortar has a 3.6 kilometer range, right? 3,600 meters. And he had expected, like, all right, bang, and expected to see the round hit somewhere on the mountainside. And okay, we'll just from there. And he said it was at that point that he was like, man, where is it? And they fired another one. And okay, man, where did that thing go? And he was like, then I looked down and saw them going off down in the valley.
Yeah.
And he's like, I realized it didn't matter that I had a 60 millimeter mortar, because I wasn't going to hit the guy on the other side of the valley anyways.
Right. But
he was going to be able to shoot at me with whatever they had. They had Russian 50 cals and things. And and Russian 14.7 millimeter heavy machine guns up in the mountains that they were going to shoot at our guys with. That, like, we never encountered things like that in Iraq. You never encountered heavier weapons. The off and on, like, it was the RPGs and the IEDs, and then like very, very seldom it would come out in some intelligence brief that an RPG 29 came into theater and knocked out a Bradley or took out an Abrams or something like that. But you always knew that those were very specialized, like, oh, that was some Syrian money that, you know, got their hands on an RPG 29 and went in and took out an Abrams, and they're back in, you know, Aleppo partying it up, having killed some infidels, like, because that was something that was going on in Iraq with a lot of Saudis and Syrians. But this was like, oh, those are in fighting positions. You know, they're lobbing SPG 9, like Russian recoilless rifles, down into our positions up in those valleys. And hey, we don't even know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
You know? And we had all of these, you know, these like super lightweight radar systems that we would put out in Iraq to pick up the mortar fire and the rockets that were coming in. And you could set that up in Afghanistan, but it doesn't matter because it worked. That thing had to have, it worked off of catching something twice, catching the beam twice. Okay, you get an arc of where it's going. You can pick out a point of impact. Well, when they're shooting them down from mountains, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They're coming too fast, and they're sitting up there with rockets, and they're not even having to arc them. They're just firing them into our positions. And like we were talking about earlier, like the Outpost, I think it shows so well.
The movie or the book.
The movie, The Outpost.
Yeah.
The book written by
Jake Tapper.
Jake Tapper shows,
and this
so
is based
well
on Camp Keating for our audience who haven't seen it or read it. I highly suggest it because I've seen The Outpost. It's incredible. But Camp Keating, go ahead.
Yeah, it's about the Battle of Camp Keating. Also, I think it was kind of known as PRT Kamdesh, which like a provincial reconstruction team was supposed to be reconstructing this province, these villages and these towns. Well, reconstructing what? There was nothing built there. There was literally people who were living as if culturally they had stepped out of somewhere in the Middle Ages. Like, these were people who were not connected in any way, shape, or form to a modern form of government, nor a Western.
It's not like they're going in and building a McDonald's. This is like, you know,
we're talking about building a road.
Right.
We're talking about, can we put a school in here that teaches something other than the Quran? Like that's and that is a discussion that is going to take. It's the guys who are there having those discussions, beginning and opening those discussions in a place like Afghanistan, are not going to finish them. It's just, things don't work like that. They do not work that fast. They don't work that smoothly. We're going to have this conversation for 2, 3, 4 years maybe before we come to a handshake agreement, and then maybe we start construction.
Yeah.
So you had these outposts way, way up in these mountains in places that were undefendable, that not only were indefendable from the ground, but even if you had air support, you can't get helicopters up there. Was another portion of the war that we kind of like, I always felt like the American public didn't know about Afghanistan the way that, like, those of us that were specifically having and preparing to go to Afghanistan, when you're doing all of the reading, like as an NCO, you're being like, hey, your task and your responsibility is going to be the lives of these young men going into combat. Like, it's your knowledge and the experience that you learned in Iraq and what you can learn in between that's going to get your men back home alive. And so I'm doing all of the reading. I'm reading, The Bear Went Over the Mountain, which is anyone interested in the actual tactics of Afghanistan.
This was written by a Russian, right?
Lester W. Grau wrote The Bear Went Over the Mountain, I believe.
I'm glad you brought this up because I brought it up in part 1 and couldn't remember the title of the book. So I'm glad you're bringing it up now for the audience. The Bear Went Over the Mountain.
So The Bear Went Over the Mountain is, Lester Grau went and interviewed all of these ex-Soviet officers and generals and commanders, all the way down to, he has, excerpts from sergeants about battles. So you get this full map detail of, oh, well, we were here and they were here, and this is what the issues were. The second part of that book it's called The Other Side of the Mountain. And that's where you learn why it's impossible to win. And the other side of the mountain was, I can't remember the man's name, but it's Lester W. Grau. And I can't remember the man's name, but he went and met with all of the Mujahideen commanders that they could find after the war and talked about all of these battles. And so you have these battles tactically from both sides, from the commanders and from soldiers on the ground of both sides, talking about the tactics. And that was just one of the things that kept striking me, like, oh, it doesn't matter. Even when the Russians were winning, they weren't winning.
Yeah.
Even when they would consider it a tactical victory, the Afghans were like, yeah, they kept saying they won, but like, we knocked out 6 BMPs, took 2 trucks full of ammunition, and like shot down a Hind.
Yeah.
10 guys got martyred, but that's what they're here for.
Exactly.
And so it just became this idea of like, man, I just don't know. Like when you're going and starting to prepare for this, it's
at that point you're just there trying to stick it out, stay alive, and hold position.
And I was down in a river valley. We were right off Highway 1, and then I got to spend my little time like out in Hellmand, living in a foxhole, and like that was another experience of in Iraq. It was your experience varied from how far you were kind of from the flagpole. And in Afghanistan, you could get very far from the flagpole very quickly. Like we were a platoon and a like kind of a advise and assist team, and then a special operations team on the other side of the ridgeline. Like we were very far from anybody else. There were some Marines, but they were way the hell down that valley, you know?
Yeah.
And they're not going to get to you because it's going to take them quite some time to get to you. So this is that kind of feeling of, I don't know if you can get there, but it's that feeling of kind of like, what did kind of Custer feel like? You know, when you're going up into those mountains and you're riding back into those hills, and you go, at some point, somebody on Custer's staff was like, this is a bad idea. And that's one of those things that I think is so frustrating for me, you know, at the end of this war, like is the continuation of bad ideas, of knowing it's a bad idea, and still we continue on. Because to change, to adjust our tactics would be to somehow admit defeat, and admitting defeat is somehow worse than an actual defeat. And that's what like I think some of us that I've talked to, some veterans, that we just find to be so frustrating about that all is like there was just so many bad ideas that anybody on the ground would look at this and say, this is a bad idea. Any infantryman on the ground, any cavalrymen, as they were on the ground there at Camp Kamdesh, knew that this is an undefendable position.
Right.
They can literally shoot machine guns down from a 1,000-foot cliff. You know, it's impossible.
With precision.
With precision.
Not even with maybe the most precise weapons, but just they have a camp. It's right there. Just open fire.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that just makes you ask, like, man, who was making these decisions?
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe that kind of leads us into what we talking about, the Afghan evacuations and how like.
Well, before we get to that, before we get to the evacuation, so we're leading up to sort of what the work you're doing with interpreters. Yeah. So if you're in these bases and you have an interpreter come in, did you bring them from, Kabul, or where did they join you? Or did they know the culture up in the mountains?
So there's a couple things I could talk about. One thing, I think another thing that people don't understand is like some of these interpreters, like they were contracted by like third-party contractors. So like third-party contractors brought them in and like did all sorts of shady shit to these people. And it's one of those things that like this, as we continue on, it's like the sullying of like the honor and like the reputation of America is what I find like so frustrating about it. It's like the lack of virtue in like, did we expect war profiteers to be in some way, shape, or form like honorable? But one of the things is they knew that our interpreters at 2 years would get SIV, would get their special immigrant visas. So they would bring in whole batches of them. And the only ones that they would offer them a pay raise at 2 years. And then so they would keep the ones that were doing like really, really, really well. They keep those ones. And then everybody else, no matter what, they would fire at 18 months and they would say they would fire them for cause. Right.
Yeah.
And you would have all of these Afghans who now got fired for reason. These guys spoke multiple languages, spoke English, have no reason. And then they got kicked out onto the street so that some contractor could pocket like an extra couple $100,000. And it's things like that that just go like, man, no wonder, you know?
And then then at that point, they're months short of being able to get an SIV.
Yeah, months short of being able to get an SIV. And then you can't get hired again because everybody's going to look it back and go, well, this guy got fired for, who knows what he got fired for, but he got fired for something. So
yeah,
it was just, unless you knew somebody that would be like, hey man, can you hire this guy?
Yeah. And it wasn't like they were going to get hired by the Afghans. They're now working with the Americans. So they're putting their lives at risk, their families at risk.
Exactly. Yeah. And so
and they're in a catch-22. So that
was, I think it plays to a bigger, I think, Sean, it plays to a bigger thing too. It plays to a bigger idea of, you had in Afghanistan, you had two competing narratives and you had two ideas of a world. You had the idea of the Taliban, of they were going to institute exactly what it is that they wanted to institute. And then you had the idea of like a free Western Afghanistan, you know, of a free Afghan, you know, of a, through their own cultural lens, a free Afghan. And I think specifically a free Afghan woman. And I kind of use that term in capital A, capital W, you know, Afghan woman, like the more the idea than the actual individual, because it's one of those things that when I would speak with my interpreters these are guys who grew up went to schools, their families probably had a little bit more money than the average rural Afghan, but you know, that didn't mean they were disconnected entirely from it. They just kind of had more of an understanding of Afghanistan as a part of the world.
Yeah.
Instead of Afghanistan as being, this is where I live and this is all there is. And so they understood that there was a different way to do things. There's a different culture out there. There's, hey, maybe our women can go to school. Maybe they can, you know, be doctors and be lawyers and be accountants and take part in business and have a part in society. You know, still within our cultural context and within our cultural frameworks, but that idea of like, there was something else, there was something different.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like that idea of like an American dream. They had an Afghan dream of a different Afghanistan. And for a lot of them, it was, you know, wanting to come here to the United States, my interpreters, and because they wanted a better life for their family. They wanted safety, they wanted security. And that as long as there was a Taliban, it was never going to be safe for them because.
And they probably knew that there wasn't going to be a point where the Taliban were just gone or that they would just not come back.
There was never in any of the, I don't know, I guess it's difficult to look at it from like when I was boots on the ground, but even when I wasn't in uniform, when I was talking with them, you know, in the months prior to kind of the fall of Kabul, there was never this feeling of that it was all just going to collapse. There was always this idea of like, well, Helmand, Zabul, Herat, Kandahar, those will probably all go. But that's kind of the Pashtun homeland and those places, those specifically like Helmand and Kandahar, were described to me once. And I think all of the Mountaineer fans won't appreciate this, but all the Pitt fans really will. But I had an Afghan interpreter describe it to me as like, well, you got to understand out there in Helmand, they're like West Virginias. He described it like it's Afghanistan's West Virginia. He's like, they don't care about whatever law you say there is because this is Helmand.
Yeah.
It's not we don't care. And it's like that idea of like, yeah, there's a law in West Virginia, but how much of a law actually gets out into the holler?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
How much actual law is there deep, deep back in Idaho? You know?
Yeah. That was one thing I was going to ask is like, what is the view of the government when you go out into that, you know, when you get really far out into there, like
that kind of gets, I think, into again, that those big strategic missteps, those, where did we make the mistakes that kind of like, that killed us? And I think one of them is a like very, very narrow focus on the cities. There was this idea that, and I think it was really kind of narrowed in under the Obama administration, of this idea that if we can urbanize Afghanistan, if we can bring about an urban Afghanistan where you have urban centers of in like industry and technology, then we'll be able to pull the people from the rural valleys into the cities where they'll have access to education and to healthcare and to all of the accoutrements of the Western world.
Right.
And I think that that was a massive miscalculation, in that the outreach to the Afghan living in his village was so lacking that the only outreach he saw was an American soldier or an Afghan National Army soldier or an Afghan National Police soldier who, again, now I think this is something that maybe kind of can structure a little bit of context around Afghanistan. Is you have in Afghanistan this like individualness combined with your cultural and tribal relationship with, which leads you to a society where literally it is me against my brother over something. It's me and my brother against my cousin. Me, my brother, and my cousin against another tribe. You know, it's me, my brother, my cousin, our tribe, and that other tribe against another clan. And it's me, my brothers, our cousins, our tribe, and that clan against anyone from outside of Afghanistan. And so you have this like narrow pocketed view of the world where it's like, yeah, but this is my town. This is my village.
Right.
You're not going to come in here. And the fact that you're here is the issue. And there was I can't remember where I heard this, you know, but it was a parable about Afghanistan. There's a man and he's walking through Afghanistan. And he's got nothing with him. He's just got a stick, and he's walking through Afghanistan, and an old man stops him and he says, "Hey, you know, what are you doing, man? Like, why are you walking through Afghanistan? You don't have a rifle. You just have a stick. Like, you're asking for trouble. You should sell everything you have and get a rifle. You're asking for trouble walking through Afghanistan." So the guy goes and he goes, "Oh, I need a rifle. I better go find myself a rifle." So he sells everything he has and he gets himself a rifle. And he's walking through and he goes back to the old man, and the old man says, "What are you doing? You're walking through Afghanistan with a rifle. You're asking for trouble. What are you doing walking through Afghanistan with a rifle? You're asking for trouble." And it's that idea of like, there is no real win here.
Yeah.
That's the parable. There is no real walking into my village is the issue.
Yeah.
Whether you walk into my village with or without a rifle, it's the issue is you're here.
Yeah.
You're not from here.
And there was never, I mean, unless we were committed to a century of occupation, quote unquote, and education, and working with them. Even then, it's like, how long do you stay?
Yeah, and I think that gets into that question of is it the job of our military to try to impose some sort of cultural change upon somebody? Because that's what, at the end of the day, we were asking of, specifically the Pashtun. Now, when we look at the Taliban, it has to be looked at through that cultural lens of the Taliban is a Pashtun organization. Whether or not we consider them to be a legitimate government or a terrorist organization, that seems to be up to whoever is in charge. The Trump administration considered them a terrorist organization until they considered them a semi-legitimate government. The Biden administration seems to be considering them a government. So we find ourselves in a situation where you have what was a Pashtun tribal religious movement, which has now stepped its way into the international community. And I struggle to think that we saw that being the end game here as the preferable end game.
Yeah. And
that's where in Afghanistan is we struggled so greatly with that outreach into those deep villages out in Pashtunistan that, that Pashtunistan area is the kind of the term for it. And it's that cross-border Pakistan, Afghanistan area.
Yeah.
Pashtunistan, is there a border? Okay, show
Yeah.
me.
Right.
Go ahead, take me to the border and show me what's Afghanistan and what's Pakistan. Because your first problem is going to be getting
Right.
there. Go ahead and get there to
Yeah.
show me where it's at, because they're not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Totally.
And we struggled with that outreach to those villages.
And
we never went out to those villages to say, hey, these are the pros. This is what we can do for you. This is how we can bring water and jobs and agriculture in. And you found yourselves in this, okay, well, also in Afghanistan, nothing grows. This is a very, very, very harsh terrain. Corn barely grows, but what does grow is opium. And what also grows is cannabis. And it grows like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
10, 15-foot tall weed fields. Guys having machine gun fights 6 feet from each other. You can't see the Taliban 6 feet from you, shooting machine guns through cannabis plants. It just, those things grow, and you could pay the farmers to not grow opium, but then the Taliban is going to come and they're going to ask him, like, hey man, where's all that opium? And so he grows cannabis, and well, then what are we going to do? Burn his fields down because he's growing cannabis to make hash? And so we would then give them fertilizer, to grow other crops, to grow soybeans, which isn't number one. Nobody in Afghanistan has ever eaten a soybean.
Yeah.
Why are we trying to have them grow soybeans? Corn, they had grown, they would try to grow that. So we'd have to provide them with fertilizer, but you need high nitrogen fertilizer, which, sorry to tell you, is also the number one ingredient in homemade explosives. So to solve the issue of getting people to not blow us up, to not build bombs, we were giving them more ingredients to build bombs and asking them to put it on the ground. And put it onto their fields. And then you wonder why, like, man, we find ANFO everywhere here. You find all of, basically, like, the vast majority of the explosives in Afghanistan, the IEDs that were killing troops and maiming troops, was very simple ammonium nitrate fuel. It was the same things that the Oklahoma City bombing, what he used, but fertilizer and diesel fuel is what they were using in the right amounts. And you add a couple special things here and special things there, and you get yourself some halfway decent explosives. And this is what they were using. And it was the fertilizer that we were giving was being then turned into bombs. And so you're in this crazy catch-22 of, like, well, we want them to grow corn, but the only way corn grows is if we give them bomb making materials.
Right.
And everything we have runs on batteries. And now you can't throw batteries out because they would take dead batteries. And the ingenuity is what kind of always struck me, of, like, there was a thing that was said that when I heard it, I was like, I don't know, man. I read The Other Side of the Mountain. It doesn't seem to make sense. They refer to the Taliban as cavemen with AKs. I just said, like, man, these guys would take 24 AA batteries and then link them all in series to create enough voltage to set off electrical detonator caps. That's not a caveman.
No.
That's an incredibly intelligent human being who understands electrical engineering, who understands how to run things in series and not in parallel, and how knows, like, so this idea that we were fighting some sort of, like, illiterate rube, well, the vast majority of them were illiterate. Yeah, that doesn't mean they didn't know how to make a bomb. It also didn't mean they didn't know the fighting positions that their fathers and grandfathers fought in.
And that's something that I think the American public, myself probably included as a civilian, would definitely think, like, we're fighting guys who are up in the mountains, like, dwelling in caves that are illiterate. Why aren't we winning? This seems like a slam dunk.
Yeah, well, it's very simple to defeat a lumbering armored army. It has been the tactic of the smaller, less equipped, but playing on their home field. It is the war of the guerrilla. It is the war of the flea. I don't have to kill all of you. I just have to keep killing you. And that's the idea, is these people didn't need much to defeat us. They didn't need GPS systems. They
and
didn't need
F-32 or F-22s, and
yeah, they didn't need any
yeah.
of that. And all of those things were in the end, I think, a detriment. There was a way to win this war outside of the way that we as Americans like to conduct war. There was another idea that was kind of somewhere in between like what was going on with the Americal division in Vietnam and Colonel Kurtz. You know, you got to walk that line.
Yeah.
Right. You don't want Colonel Kurtz in the mountains going native. And you also don't need like big hulking divisions, which just lumber around and are just being picked apart by the Viet Cong. Like there has to be an in-between. And there was an in-between that could have been done, but we like this idea of we put a unit into combat, it does its 18-month, 15-month, 12-month, 9-month tour, whatever it is, and then we bring it back home and we bring the boys home. And I was like, yeah, but every single 9 months you lose the institutional knowledge of that valley. You lose the knowledge of every fighting position. You lose the knowledge of every single place that they like to attack you from. And the vast majority of casualties in combat occur at the beginning and the end of tours. They occur when you don't know what the hell is going on. You have no idea where they're shooting at you from. And at the end, when you're getting complacent and you're ready to go home.
Right.
And so there was a way to win that war. And I think it was somewhere in between having units that you had RC South, and that general was going to be there for 3 years, and those troops were going to be there for 3 years, you know? And it was a rotational thing where maybe troops were rotating out every 12 months. And hey, if like they did in Vietnam, if you dig it here and you like it and you're cool with that, you can stay.
Right.
Sign your papers and you can stay. We'll even give you a new rifle,
right,
and send you wherever you want. But you have that institutional knowledge. And there was plenty of guys that you ask them, do you want to go to Thailand for 3 weeks and chill out and then go back to Afghanistan? They'd say, sure, man, I'll sign up for another 9 months. Because there is a portion of a young man that finds in combat that belonging and that purpose that you could keep a guy there for quite a long time. And the institutional knowledge we would have built up over over all of that time would have been the knowledge to say, hey, listen, I'm the guy who's been here for 2.5 years now. And we've been talking about education for girls.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about medical clinics, and we've been talking about an economy, and we've been talking about what future do you see for your village? Because that's something that we got so caught up in telling them what it is that we were going to do for them. We never got to asking them what was the future that you had in your mind for Afghanistan, because some of these villages would have and did tell us straight away, like, we don't want you.
Right. We just want what we have. And that's what we have. It's what we're used to. That's what we have always done for, centuries. And
that's where you have the opportunity for there to have been something different, for there to have been an idea of, listen, we've been here talking for 2 years about how it can be different, about how these girls can be educated. And we have that conversation every single Friday, of whatever it is that you sit down with a person and you have tea and you get to know each other and you can discuss things. But we got so caught up in the rotation in, rotation out that, like, by the time a guy had built trust with you, it was like, hey man, I'm getting out of here. I'm
totally
leaving. And it was
and
that
like
idea.
and the Taliban's playing the other side. So I mean,
hey, guess what? Those guys are leaving.
Yeah.
Hey, guess what?
We're coming in.
They're leaving. They're not going to be here. Those Americans are rotating home. And at some point, and this is that it really reminds me of a specific moment in Afghanistan. I was training this Afghan army mortar platoon. And it was, young soldiers are going to be young soldiers with no NCO support. They were just being young soldiers and weren't particularly interested in doing what we were doing. And I remember, like, having this moment of blowing up at them and being like, with my interpreter, being like, tell them exactly what I'm saying and use all the words that you need to get my point across. And telling them we're leaving. Guys, if you don't get it now, you're never going to get it. We're leaving. We're not going to be here forever. The only thing all of these guys back here were doing on this American base that you can't see behind those big, tall concrete walls, all they're doing is retrograde operation. It's tearing stuff down. It's pulling stuff apart. It's getting it back to our bases to fly it out, to fly it home, to get it out of here. We're leaving. And this was in 2013.
Yeah.
So 7 years, 8 years. And we're leaving. We're getting out of here. You guys have to prepare. You guys have to know what you're doing because we're not going to be here. And one day the commandos aren't going to show up. You're going to need to know what you're doing. And if you don't, the Taliban's going to come over those walls and they're going to cut your heads off.
Yeah.
They're going to kill all of you. And we're not going to be here to save you. And that was that moment of honesty with those Afghan troops, of telling them, and I told them, we're done for the day. Like, go tell your lieutenant that I sent you home because you weren't doing any work. But it was that moment of honesty. Like, listen, I needed to get it out. Like, if you guys don't get it, because it was incredibly difficult to see an army which had this kind of, the Afghan commando force was very good, very professional. And like, that was as close as you were going to get to like an American infantry unit. A lot of the Afghan army units, it kind of depended on the leadership. I saw some units that were excellent, that were incredibly well led, like we had Afghan officers which spoke English, and you get to speak with them and kind of blown away by like the professionalism with which they're conducting themselves in this war. And then you're seeing them have to deal with like, the nepotism and the nonsense of higher command of like a major or a colonel in the Afghan army who's hired on his like idiot cousin to be in charge of this guy. And you're like, man, I feel for you. I feel for it, Yeah. And that was one of those moments of like, you have that interplay of, you had Afghan army units which were just worth nothing, and then you had some that would fight like lions. And it was one of those, it was I think in the president's speech I think it brought me just to like such a moment of being like, but you're lying, is when he said that that we're having to do this and fight for Afghans that aren't fighting for their own country. And I just wanted to say, like, that's a lie, man. That's a lie. I watched them fight. Like, I had an Afghan soldier take a bullet like right here, firing like from a PKM machine gun that was firing at me and my mortar team, and it killed the Afghan soldier like in a tower right next to me. And so to hear like the commander in chief say that these men weren't fighting and that they didn't fight, it's like, man, they took tens of thousands of casualties year after year after year. I watched an Afghan battalion get like chewed up trying to get through this mountain pass. And it's one of those moments that like you don't particularly view military operations in that manner anymore, but it was like some sort of World War II kind of, it was supposed to go 30 days, or 5 days, but 30 days later, where, we think we'll get that mountain pass open today. And like, oh God.
And just keep throwing people at it.
We're just going to keep throwing Afghan companies into this thing and watch them get torn apart. And you have like the first day in American route clearance platoon, like an American route clearance platoon is one of those things that can basically knock out every IED threat out there,
Yeah.
And they made it about a quarter of a mile before every vehicle had been disabled, not just from IED fire, but from direct fire weapons, from SPG-9s, from RPGs, from recoilless rifles. They were knocking out vehicles with recoilless rifles. And you go like, man, they're just more committed down here. They're just down in Helmand. They're just a little bit more committed. And Helmand, you went down into the Marines. Hellmann was the British first controlled Hellmann, was kind of the idea is the British got Hellmand, the Canadians got Kandahar. And the Canadians, I think they were very, very underserved by their government. The Canadians fought with everything that they had, but they were just vastly undersupplied for what they were being asked to do there in Kandahar.
Mm-hmm.
The Brits and the British paratroopers down in Helmand and in Sangin were like heroes. Those dudes, the stories of heroism of the British paratrooper regiment in Afghanistan is, it is now becoming stuff of legend down there in Helmand.
And just so I'm clear, this is when the British were
in
there,
Helmand, yeah.
And not during the U.S. led invasion.
No, this was early in the war. So from about
Okay.
2001,
Yeah.
2002 timeframe until
Okay.
around 2011 or 12.
Okay.
The Brits basically were in control of Helmand, and then the U.S. Marine Corps took over
Gotcha.
Helmand province. When I was there, we rolled through a number of British lines.
Mm-hmm.
There was still British platoons and British armored platoons out there, but the vast majority was U.S. Marines out there. But Helmand was different in just its geography. It's basically a big, giant desert,
Mm-hmm.
mountainous region, and then these very tightly packed, green, lush valleys that you go from being in a desert mountain to being in a jungle almost. Like you can't see in front of you. The cannabis plants are so tall. And then when we were there in February and March, they had just planted all of the poppy. And so it was just as far as the eye could see, it was just the little poppies, just every field was poppy.
Yeah.
And it was, when I was there, it was something like 90% of the world's heroin was coming out of Helmand province. And it was just that the entire economy of Helmand was pretty much opium based, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's flash forward a bit.
Yeah.
As we get into like the evacuation.
Yeah.
And sort of what your view of it was. And, you'd been working with these interpreters as well over the course of your time there, and obviously developed some pretty close relationships with them. So what was happening on the ground in Afghanistan, and what were you hearing from the people that you had been working with?
So the evacuation kind of, it all for me has been wrapped up in, my daughter was born, and then Afghanistan started to collapse. And so kind of in this moment of like joy, I was also dealing with this immense feeling of like sadness and of helplessness of my interpreters, guys that I'd worked with every day for 9 months, had conversations like when you spend, 8, 10, 12 hours a day with somebody, like there's only, you can only talk about so many little nonsensical things before you have to actually start having deep conversations.
Right.
And so I got to have really deep conversations about like, well, what does the future look like for you? And what is it that you want to do? And getting to see them and have these relationships like that, to me, really, it kind of showed me that idea of there was two Afghanistans. There was that idea of the Taliban, and then the idea of the people who wanted something different, something more free, something more Western, where they could have a wife who could go out and have a job, and they could raise their kids. And so getting to see that and know that it was like, oh, it's not just that one guy, it's an aberration. It's like kind of him and his whole family they all kind of think the same way. And oh, his family also works with the coalition. And that's what you saw is the vast majority of the interpreters came from families that were working either with the Afghan army or the Afghan police. They're working in the Afghan government. They were interpreters. Their sisters were working with aid organizations and doing things to bring Afghanistan forward. And this was kind of the kind of cultural academic sphere of Afghanistan that was trying to bring Afghanistan forward and to bring these kind of more ruralized populations to less of a religious idea of the world, more towards a more kind of secular Western idea of basic liberalism.
Yeah.
And so as the evacuation started, it was one of the things that initially happened first was like when we left Bagram. And I think that is it's one of those things that I had somebody ask me, after this is all done, like, what can I do? And I struggle to find anything other than like, hey, call your congressman and find out, like, have them do an actual investigation, not let's find some colonel in the Pentagon to pin this on, but like, who made the decision? Number one, who made the decision to give up Bagram? Because who would give up a fortress in the mountains with 2 runways and everything you need to defend it and everything you need to conduct a safe and orderly evacuation? Why would you not even tell the Afghans that you're partnered with, that you're allied with, that you're leaving? They didn't even tell them that they were leaving, Sean. They just left.
Yeah.
And how the Afghans found out that they had been abandoned at Bagram Air Base was when the power went out. And when they went over to say, hey, man, power went out. Where is everybody?
Yeah.
They had been abandoned. And that's what I find to be so frustrating, is that feeling of abandonment. These are my friends. These are my allies. These are men that fought next to me. You know, and for us to have abandoned them in such a manner, to me, is it's shameful. And it's the word that I kept coming back to is it's unconscionable. This cannot be looked at with a conscience and say that this is right. And that this is in any way a logical, reasonable plan that we somehow came up with or coordinated, because I was just an E5, man. I was just a sergeant, but I can tell you, you don't want to be doing an evacuation from a international airport in the middle of a city surrounded by mountains. You don't want to be doing an evacuation from there. You would much rather, given the opportunity, do it from a fortress in the mountains with multiple runways and multiple gates and multiple layers of security through which you can move and maneuver and bring people in. And I think that that's what became so frustrating, is that I was dealing with it on both sides. I was talking to friends of mine who were in the 82nd Airborne, who were on the ground, friends of mine in the Special Forces who were on the ground there in Kabul at Hamid Karzai Airport. And I'm also talking to Afghans who are good friends, good friends of mine, guys that when we text, we call each other brother, because these are guys who, like, listen, I doubt that I would be where I'm at today or in the positions I would be in if it wasn't for these guys, because not only were they kind of hey, help me get through these difficult conversations with the Afghan army about X, Y, or Z. Hey, man, give me a little bit of cultural insight on this or that. Or, hey, man, just help me. Like, it was just, these are people that are incredibly, incredibly good human beings. And for me to be like stuck in between trying to, I'm trying to talk to this guy into them, and seeing it from both sides, what it just became was chaos. It was just plain and pure chaos. And it was guys on the ground who were trying to do everything they could to help people like me who were outside of Afghanistan, trying to get people that we knew were like, listen, the Taliban that is in control now is being sold to the American public as a kinder, gentler Taliban. Well, that's a lie. There is no kinder, gentler Taliban, and there's never going to be a kinder, gentler Taliban. It's just taking time. The execution's already started. And that's where I found such like frustration, is in the seeing it and hearing it from what was going on the ground, and from people who were there. It was saying like, hey, they're shooting people in the streets right now in Kabul. That was difficult to hear, and
which we weren't getting much information of, if any at all.
And I think that Sean, was another one of those very frustrating things of seeing the lies in real time. And we're in a time when, like, you can see lies happening in real time. And I kept seeing this idea of like, well, this has been nothing but a smashing success, and seeing the State Department talk about nothing but a smashing success, 120,000 people evacuated. Like, I'm absolutely ecstatic about every person that we got out. I'm so very thankful about that. But the enormity of the issue demanded a Berlin airlift level, military engagement of saying, we are going to get our people out.
Right.
It wasn't for lack of aircraft. That's a lie. Every single refueling aircraft in the military arsenal, the thousands of them, can be repurposed as cargo and troop transports in 2 hours. They were built that way. They were just built that way because we knew we might have to move mass amounts of people at some point.
Right.
So hearing lies and knowing, but like behind the curtain. Oh, that's a lie. They have the capability. They have the, like, listen, there's no reason that we couldn't say, we're taking this airfield. We're putting a C-17 down every 60 seconds. And guess what? There's no civilian airliners taking off. We're putting a C-17 down every 60 seconds, and we'll give you a window to take off every hour.
Yeah.
There was no reason why we couldn't have done that. But it just seemed like we had come to the conclusion that the game was lost. And that even though the game was lost, we shouldn't even try to salvage it. We should just let it be a blowout. And that's what it felt like. And sometimes it was like you were watching them run up the score in real time.
Yeah, yeah.
When you were seeing things, and you were seeing entire armories get captured and caches, and being on some text threads with Afghan veterans who, you know, guys who fought in Afghanistan in different units, and kind of keyed in on the right signal channels of where you can find like real factual information, and seeing like, man, hey, and knowing, hey, the 205th Corps just surrendered, the 215th Corps just surrendered, like, and seeing armories full of weapons falling to the Taliban, it was like, hey, man, this isn't being covered by the news.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody's talking about the fact that like multiple capitals and provinces are falling and everything's collapsing back to Kabul. And that's where I just found this to be this, we were just stuck in this cycle of being told everything was going well. And then in reality, it's like, hey, I can't even get my people, like, even if I could know for sure that they were on some list somewhere in Hamid Karzai Airport, to get them onto a plane, the issue is I can't even get them to the gate because I have to get them through the Taliban first. And then I have to get them through the mass of humanity that was packing those gates, and then get them to try to find somebody who has their name and who knows who they are and can point to those people and say, okay, now this went on for like a week and a half that we're trying to get people through these gates. And it just, the situation became one where we were lucky to be able to have some intelligence from on the ground and be able to push our people away from the Abbey Gate. And that, like, it may have saved people's lives, you know?
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Adam Zaffuto. Please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube so you are the first to know next week when we bring you part 2 of our conversation with Adam. Please reach out to me, Shaun, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org with any questions, comments, or concerns. We look forward to seeing you all next week for part 2. I want to thank Millerstown Pick Apart for their generous support and sponsorship of this program. For Millerstown's hours, direction, inventory, and pricing, go to pickapartyard.com. That's PICAPARTYARD.com. Thank you so much, Millerstown, and we'll see you on the next Scuttlebutt.